This is Indicating the Real. My name is Joe.
My name is Michael.
And we are continuing on Chapter 2 of Seth Speaks, the eternal validity of the soul. We're talking about Chapter 2. We talked about it a little bit last time. Last time we talked about the introduction, and we got through a lot of the information in Chapter 1, and we started on Chapter 2. And we're going to finish it off probably this time.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the subtitle, because that's kind of almost the title. And I have a book club friend that just calls this the eternal validity of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that. Seth Speaks is kind of like, just like, hey.
It's like a branding thing.
Yeah, it's just kind of like announcing what's happening. And like that is kind of a big part of anyone's introduction to this material is like, what's going on here? Seth is speaking. Who is Seth?
Yeah.
Etc.
And like a review from last time, essentially, Seth is this sort of extra-dimensional psychological entity that's being channeled through Jane Roberts, the human, writer of the book, or dictator, I suppose.
Yeah, it's funny when he's explaining the structure of his self, and then almost every time he illustrates something about his place or his capabilities, he'll say like, oh, and this applies to you too.
Right, yeah.
You just don't know. You're just this like fringe part that's cut off your consciousness from this broader, deeper, interdimensional structure to your own self.
Right. And Seth too is like just a part of like a larger consciousness, right? It's like Seth's like the personality he talks about.
As far as I know, he talks about that just extending forever until like infinity.
And just higher and higher levels.
Yeah, and then like that gets into like a concept that really isn't that new, that like we're all one.
Gotcha.
Like
so like the infinity of level,
yeah,
is like the all soul sort of.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's also interesting like as much depth and knowledge he brings when he starts talking about stuff that even he doesn't know or can't imagine or is unsure about.
Right, yeah, because there's limitations still there.
But you get used to him speaking in this authoritative manner. He's like, this is how it is, and he's just like, it's coming from such a level that, you start to just like buy into it a little bit.
Yeah, that's one thing that I noticed reading through Chapter 2. I sort of remember making a mental note of it, that like, a lot of it is very declarative sentences. It's like, this is what this is. Like, this is what's happening.
Yeah, I think I touched on that last week, but basically he's not taking a lot of time to tell you like, oh, that makes sense because of this and this and this. Those details do come out like as it goes through, like people have questions and like he'll explain everything. It all kind of like is coherent within its own self, but he's just laying it out there right now.
Yeah, you just kind of have to wait for him to get to that topic for like, further explanations.
Yeah, and so this chapter, it's called My Present Environment, Work, and Activities. And like I was saying, for everything he's saying about himself, like he relates that back to our own reality and is trying to broaden our idea of that as we go.
And this is sort of, from what I took, the chapter, it's Seth's going to tell you a lot more about like, where is Seth? Like, what is Seth? What does it look like for Seth to like walk around and like do stuff, right? Like,
kinda, yeah. Like he starts off, I like this, he's talking about his own environment. He said, I can assure you with ironic understatement that it is as vivid, varied, and vital as physical existence. It's more pleasurable, more rewarding, and offering far greater opportunities for creative achievement. It's the most challenging one I have known. He's just like letting you know that it's not like, eternal rest or anything like that. And all our worries about death or an afterlife seem to revolve around like, what is it or what isn't it?
Because that's the central question that came out from Chapter 1, right? Is Seth wanted, one of the main messages was to tell people like, hey, when you die, it's not like the end of stuff. And when you die, you enter a different plane of existence. And this is sort of where Seth is living, is one of those planes of existence.
Well, the very right after what I just read, he gets into that. He says, my environment now is not the one in which you will find yourself immediately after death. I cannot help speaking humorously, but you must die many times before you enter this particular plane of existence.
Right.
So we're like moving closer towards where he is.
It's sort of like reincarnation, but if you're not reincarnating into the same physical world, you're sort of like going up a level every time. Like you're kind of leveling up every time you die, maybe.
I think the terms that he describes death is kind of like maybe it's later in this chapter or the next chapter, but it's kind of it's a change of focus more so. And depending on where you are in your reincarnational cycle, it is like that leveling up. And he has his own complicated way of explaining reincarnation and stuff that I think will come up later in this book. I'm trying to debate like how much I should just like spill out my own memory of it, or we should just wait till we get to some of these things.
We can maybe focus on what's in the chapter. I know he says, I thought this was an interesting part where he said that birth is more of a shock than death is.
Love that. I've never heard that before, and it makes so much sense intuitively.
Right. That like birth would be like just a wave of like stimulation, you know?
Yeah, he says sometimes when you die, you do not realize it, but birth almost always implies a sharp and sudden recognition.
Yeah.
Like most of us are born screaming.
Right. Yeah.
And
that's
a lot of
it
us
healthy.
just like fall asleep and die, or just,
yeah,
you just kind of pass.
You sort of like fade away.
Yeah.
It's not as sudden a lot of the time for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think he says, like the place that we do go to immediately after death is very similar, if not the same, as like places we visit in dreams. So like as smooth or unsmooth as that transition is, it can be that smooth in death. You just like slip into a dream.
And dreams, I think, is a good way to frame it too. That's one of the things I have written down is that, for me, reading all of what Seth like has to say about his environment, like the way that it made the most sense to me, understanding conceptually what it would be like, is it sort of seems like these other planes of existence are sort of like what it feels like to be in a really vivid dream.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because they're like impermanent and they're also like very like changeable.
Yeah.
But like it seems like, at least the way Seth's writing it, Seth puts in a lot of like three-dimensional like physical metaphors, So like through at least the metaphor of how he's talking about it, it's like you could be in a room and then you could change whether it's day or night, and you could change whether the walls are made of brick or wood, and you can change, the size and shape of things. And like, all these different things are like very changeable depending on like your mood.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to imagine, but like if you had the experience of a lucid dream, and I feel like everybody maybe has had a tiny bit of that, some people more than others, obviously, but like when you realize you're in a dream and then you're at that point where like, okay, what now? What do I want to do? And most people like think of like, oh, I'm going to fly.
Yeah.
And I've had experiences where like I think that, and then I do fly, and I've had experiences where I think that, and like immediately that experience of flying like changes my emotion or focus in a way that it just pulls me out of the dream.
Right.
But Seth repeatedly tells us that like we need to like take our dreams as a valid part of reality and learn how, their rules more so we can incorporate that. And that is part of like that bridging from the inner ego from the outer ego to the inner ego.
Yeah. Should I skip to the end of the chapter?
Yeah, if it's relevant to what we're talking about, we can skip.
Well, I think one of the most interesting frames about the whole chapter is like this sort of, it takes the idea of how we currently see ourselves vis-a-vis the dreaming world, where it's like if we're awake, we're like aware of what's happening truly. And when we're dreaming, we're sort of in more of like a trance, right? Like we are in this world of illusion. But it's sort of, Seth flips it on its head, where it's like at the end, the thing that we find out is that we in the physical world are experiencing something very akin to dreaming, but we're the ones that are sort of in a trance by the physical world.
Yeah, he says like we're in a trance just as much as the woman who is speaking now, something like that.
Right.
Very interesting, but it makes sense to me. And we were talking about last week where your physical senses create reality, and it's in that same sense that we're like in this trance and the only thing we're focusing on is this bright light of the physical senses.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just, so like, I think in some sense he is stating that like we're always kind of in this mode. Like this is what reality is. It's like just a matter of like our subjective focus.
Yeah. And, conceptually speaking, that sort of makes a lot of sense. If you think about it, we're like in the possibility space, like a dreaming mind has a higher amount of possibility happening in it than an awake mind does. So thinking of like how you would nest these concepts, it seems like you could nest the awake mind inside of the larger possibility space of the sleeping mind. So like that to me seems like pretty credible. It's kind of an interesting thing that seems very obvious, but I feel like I haven't heard as much before.
Yeah. And I mean, regardless of how it is, Seth is like pointing us to the fact that our culture doesn't really take dreams seriously.
Right. Yeah.
We think of it as this kind of like leftover, like the brain has all this garbage that it just has to like process while we're sleeping or something. Like there's various theories along those lines. I got something near the beginning. He says, we are aware of the inner laws that govern all materializations. And then he's talking about his environments, how you're talking about he can change the setting if he wants. And then he's like, my associates would take his changing forms of environment as immediate clues to his mood, feelings, and ideas.
Yeah. That was so interesting to me because it reminds me of like how you would write like a novel or like a movie, where it's like you're taking this internal sort of expression and you're externalizing it.
Yeah.
Like it's just like good writing to be like, if you're in a scene where like somebody's like lover dies, it's like going to be raining when they go outside.
Yeah.
It's like that kind of thing where it's like, it seems that Seth saying like in their environment, that sort of just naturally happens. Like your environment's always just sort of going to reflect what it should look like for your mood.
Yeah. It's so interesting. And later he talks about this idea that our ideas about the boundary of the self, he kind of chips away at that and he calls like our entire visual field like the extension of like our visual self and our entire like, so he's like including all of our perception in the definition of a self, which also kind of relates to his idea that we're creating that whole thing.
Yeah, and that's going to be, I think, the topic of a lot of what happens in the rest of the chapter, right? Is sort of explicating this idea of like your sensation of the environment around you, all of that taken as a whole is sort of like you. You're not just your extension in physical space, like your body, You are also sort of the projection of your sensorial kind of like self.
It like he always seems to hint at it, and I don't know if he ever comes out and says it explicitly, but like when we're asking the question like what is reality, like it's almost synonymous with like what is the self in some terms here.
Right. Like, yeah, where reality and the self are sort of like seen to be two sides of the same coin.
Or like your experience, like how do you actually like, differentiate any of those? And to some extent, he's saying like there is no differentiation. This sentence was a little provocative. I don't know if I have anything to say about it. Permanency and stability basically have nothing to do with form, but with the integration of pleasure, purpose, accomplishment, and identity.
Yeah.
It feels like there's a lot there.
Well, that was one thing I sort of wondered was like, if permanency has nothing to do with form, I guess this is just, to me, it seems foreign from like my background, right? Where, if you take like a Western philosophical understanding like of forms, like forms become this very important like concept in like Platonic theory.
Yeah.
Where like forms are seen to be very stable, right? Like forms are like things can change from forms, but like the forms themselves are supposed to be sort of this eternal thing.
I kind of feel like in this context, he's talking about physical form.
Just like shape?
Because he's chipping away at our materialism, I think. So he's talking.
Can you read it again?
Permanency and stability basically have nothing to do with form, but with the integration of pleasure, purpose, accomplishment, and identity.
So permanency goes along with identity.
Yeah, I think what he's saying is like our whole like idea of objective reality, these are physical forms, but they're physical forms for pleasure, purpose, accomplishment, identity. That's why they're being created.
Yeah, but it also equates the idea of like the pleasure and purpose as like the thing that becomes permanent, right? Like
Yeah.
pleasure, purpose, and identity are more permanent than form is.
I think so. And it's through pleasure, purpose, accomplishment, and identity that we are extending permanency and stability to form.
Yeah.
It's just for those purposes.
Like it derives from that.
But our way of perceiving tricks us into the idea that like
It's the opposite.
it's inherent. Like permanency and stability are inherent in those objects, and we have the idea that there's an outside to us. And we haven't like definitively like pushed that away, but like I'm definitely more there than not there as far as, idealism goes. But I feel like it'd be interesting to like continually explore like the idealism, materialism, dual or binary there as we go along.
Well, and I think it's credible to say that form is, we can even see that form is changeable. Like the whole idea of like a platonic form being like eternal is like very like not akin to our actual experience of the world. In the actual experience of the world, you have a chair and you can say, oh, well, it has the form of a chair, but it's like you throw it out in the woods, like it's going to decay. It's going to turn into something else.
Anyone who's
always like changing.
Owned a house quickly realizes things are constantly changing.
Right. Yeah. So it's like, that seems very credible, right? To like just a very commonsensical view of the world that like, well, obviously form can't be the thing that is impermanent because in the world, forms are changing all the time.
Yeah. You have to like go down like the platonic path and like invent something that's permanent.
Right. You have to be convinced by someone's like arguments to even understand form in that other way.
Yeah.
Well, and I think too about like the whole, it's interesting that he uses the word identity there, because I feel like that's one of the things I had a lot of questions about in this chapter is like how you sort of qualify your own personal identity in such an environment, right? Because like the way you and I would understand the world is that, or at least I think, a lot of people listening probably on like a commonsensical view would say like, well, my identity is probably one of two things, right? It's either I am this body that I live in, like especially the brain, because like when brains get turned off, people tend to not, be there anymore.
Yeah.
Or they might identify with some kind of soul, right?
Yeah.
That is associated with the body. And it seems like the Seth perspective is going very much towards the second one, right? With the soul.
Well, back to the subtitle, and we're speaking of permanency right now.
Right.
The eternal validity of the soul.
Right.
But the word validity is kind of an interesting twist in there. He's not saying like the eternal soul, the eternal validity.
Right. Well, and that makes sense, right? Like, how do you judge validity? It's like you have to judge things based on some standard. And if everything's emanating from the soul already,
it's
eternally valid,
Right. I really like it. And, we get this idea also from Buddhism, like the only permanent thing is change. And I think Seth is saying that in a different way.
Well, that's the thing, though, is that the soul in Seth's view seems like it is permanent,
Temporally, but it's not unchanging. It's always changing.
That's true. I had one sort of interesting side note that I wanted to bring up and sort of ask you about. So on the bottom of 18, he's got this paragraph. Now we can also take several forms at one time, so to speak. But you can also do this. So Seth's saying that like we, like Seth and Seth's associates in this other plane, they can also take several forms at one time. But you, like you or I, right, human beings, can also do this, although you do not generally realize it. Your physical form can lie sleeping and inert upon the bed while your consciousness travels in a dream form to places quite distant. Simultaneously, you may create a thought form of yourself identical in every respect, and this may appear in the room of a friend quite without your conscious awareness. So consciousness is not limited to forms it can create at any given time. So this is so interesting to me
Yeah.
because it's like, it's this idea that you can take on multiple different types of forms in different spaces at the same time.
Yeah.
So the thing is, like, in terms of personal identity, it's so interesting because that means, like, I can be in two places at once, you know?
I think yeah, a more specific way of putting it would be like different parts of your consciousness can be in two places at once, or places in the idealism context that we're talking about are just different aspects of consciousness. Like, remember we were talking about the cat is a plane?
Yeah.
Like, this thought form that visits a friend is kind of just a different plane. It's not like necessarily a different physical place. If we're like taking this idealism idea to its extreme,
Hmm.
it's not like your friends in Montana. It's hard to say it almost. It's like Montana is just like, it's like a psychological construct that we're in this frequency or something.
Yeah. And I feel like that has to be the answer, right? Because on the one hand, like, to me, it seemed just like a really tricky. I'd never heard this. Like, this is one of those things that I feel like is sort of like a Seth original, or maybe I just haven't encountered it before. But I'm tempted generally to be sort of like drawn to this idea of like realism about dreams, right? Where, like, from the existential point of view, like, you should view dreams as being a valid type of reality. But there's this sort of personal identity issue that comes up that Seth has, like, points out really well here, that it's like, well, if my dream self is really me, like, my personal identity applies to my dream self,
Mm-hmm.
what happens when somebody comes up and finds me, like, my sleeping body? Does my personal identity not apply to the sleeping body? And Seth says, well, it does. You're in both places at the same time, which is weird because identity usually implies like a unity, you know? Like, identity is all about being one thing.
Hmm.
And if you're two things at the same time, it's like, you sort of wonder, like, is that an identity anymore, you know?
Well, I think this is all in his way of like explaining what his concept of the self is. So, for example, he would say we have the outer ego, which is what we know of ourselves, everything, and then the inner ego is creating that world. And I think we'll have to, get the details straightened out as we get into them. But like, I think the inner ego is creating multiple outer egos.
Right. And they're sort of different facets of the same identity, right?
Yeah. And it gets into this, what's strange, but I think it's also beautiful, is that like, if you're sending a different part of your consciousness into a different dimension, you're kind of gifting that part of consciousness its own free will. Like, you're creating it and it's a part of you, but like, there's this weird thing in this philosophy where like identities can be the same and go their separate ways at the same time.
Yeah, right?
It is kind of a trip.
It's kind of a trip.
But I mean, he gets into this by trying to explain what he is, and like he has all these, sounds a little too like monstrous to call them tentacles, but like all these different offshoots of consciousness going in these different directions. He's talking about like teaching in all these different dimensions, and he has to adopt his consciousness in the same way he's doing here with Jane to fit into that dimension and to follow its rules and to be able to communicate properly. And he's just merely like pointing out like physical form, dream form, thought form,
Yeah.
as ways we can recognize, oh, that is true on our level, even in our limited ways of understanding the world. I can see that, there's definitely for sure a physical form and a dream form.
Right.
The thought form is a little more fringe with like in our cultural acceptance.
What's he talking about there?
Basically this idea that like every time you like have like an intense feeling or think about, another person or a loved one, like he's saying like there's literally like a part of your consciousness on a level that's below our normal perceptive that like is like visiting them. Like, it's that thing where like, like an old friend calls you and you're like, oh, I was just thinking about you. It's that sort of thing.
It's like, I feel like a lot of people have superstitions about that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like fringe. Like, dream form is more acceptable than thought form in our culture. But like, we do have like anecdotal, not evidence, but anecdotes of such things that are related to thought forms.
See, and that, I assumed he was talking about like astral projecting or something like that.
Well, I don't think that's that different, but
Okay.
this has a different context, you know.
So like if you were astral projecting, maybe you're entering the thought form, but in such a vivid way that they can really appreciate you.
Well, I don't know what the distinction between, if astral projection might be more the dream form.
Okay. I see.
I don't know. Like the way he is about like there are no boundaries except for, you know, your abilities to
like perceive or whatever.
perceive and stuff.
Yeah.
Like it always gets tricky. And like before coming to this material, I had these definitions where, you know, a lucid dream was a dream where you're aware that you're dreaming, and astral projection was a dream that matched up with the physical world. So when you were like projecting, you could like actually go, you know, like spy on your mom as she's eating her breakfast. Like, I don't know why I chose that.
Right.
But like you're viewing part of the real world. But I think Seth, when he gets into this stuff, is saying that like astral projection isn't limited to just perceiving the physical world. And
I think that checks out with a lot of what other like people who are into that do, right? Where they project into other dimensions and stuff.
some of it's just like the semantics and the how you define these terms. He says, I share my field of existence with others who have more or less the same challenges to meet, the same overall pattern of development. I just think I think he would say the same thing about our world. And I think that makes a lot of sense. To the extent that we share this world, we're sharing like patterns of development and challenges.
Yeah, that's essentially like part of this chapter is like, we got into it a little bit last time, but it's sort of defining that like in this like plane of existence that Seth lives on, there are other beings similar to Seth, right? And I remember he describes them like they're all teachers. Like it's a plane of like beings that are like these interdimensional like teachers, sort of.
Yeah, it's very cool. And I'm sure he gets into it in this book, but like one of his main branches of his teachings is called value fulfillment. And it's basically the idea that like kind of just like following your heart. And it's cool to think that like if it's true at this level and that level or wherever, that like you follow your heart, you're doing what you want to do. And not only are you doing that, but you're surrounded by other people that are like also there. It's just kind of like I see so many friends and even in myself, like there's always this hunger for like community. And it's cool to think that like reality is just kind of like built upon this. I don't want to call it law of attraction. I feel like that has a lot of different connotations, but like it's kind of like that.
Yeah, right. Where it's like there's sort of like a universal sort of not rule but tendency for people that like are into the same sort of lifestyle or have the same sort of goals or values. We'll sort of like find each other and coalesce.
The interesting part about this plane, and again, I feel like I've said this like 10 times already in this episode, but like you'll get into it more at some point when you start thinking in those terms, and then you're in this earth dimension and you have like enemies. You're like, wait, why do I have enemies if this law is applying?
Right.
But that falls into like more or less the same challenges to me. You know, like having an enemy or what you're perceiving to be an enemy is just part of this complex of some challenge that your higher self has chosen to address.
Yeah. Well, that could bring us into emotion.
I think emotions are fine.
So talking on page 19 with emotions, right?
Yeah, do you got something or I got some highlights here?
Why don't you go with yours?
Okay, he just starts out by saying, we do have an equivalent of what you call emotions. And then he goes on to say, your feelings can best be described as three-dimensional materializations of far greater psychological events and experiences that are related to the inner senses.
That's the one I was looking for.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
But he's kind of saying the same thing about emotions as he's saying about our own consciousness. Like, I don't know how explicitly I repeated this idea last time, but he's saying that our consciousness is so big and only a tiny bit of it can fit into like physical reality.
Right.
And so there's more of us, and that's kind of his project, is to get us to realize that greater part of ourselves. And he's saying basically that our emotions are the kind of the same thing. It's kind of like it's like this giant consciousness, whatever reality, and then just a little bit of them are spilling into this plane of existence,
Yeah.
which is a trip.
I mean, to me, that quote really stuck out to me just because, like, I think that's another one of these things that, like, commonsensically, like, there's a lot of stuff there that makes sense. Like, if you think about emotions, like, even if you're just thinking inside of, like, your lived experience, there's, like, this thing where, I feel like if you do a lot of, like, introspection or meditation, you get to the point where you kind of like notice emotions before they really like peak. You can kind of see them coming and see them going, and you can see kind of how they move around inside of your psyche.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of weird insight there where like the emotional peak where you actually experience the emotion isn't all of the emotion. There's like something else like psychologically moving around underneath there. Like it is really just the tip of the iceberg of some other thing moving around in your psyche.
Interesting. That's cool that you like already kind of have like some intuition about that.
Yeah, like, and I know Seth talks about that being a part of like this like higher dimensional being, but I feel like even people like here, like, I think it's pretty accessible for most people to understand like, no, like these psychological events are like these bigger things that are happening.
Yeah, well, a lot of times people like will experience emotions like storms. They're
Yeah.
called storms sometimes. Like they just kind of overtake you. It's just like something that's far off in the distance, and then it just comes and takes you, and then you're engulfed, and then it's gone.
Right, you become surprised by them if you're not aware of them ahead of time.
Yeah, and I was definitely the type of person that was like frustrated with like they do kind of like give you a sense of like lack of control, or like a certain part of myself. And I guess that would be like my outer ego or ego is frustrated with like being taken by these emotions. The one I'll share like an anecdote or a proverb, I guess, that I got in more of my like Buddhist Vipassana meditation days, but like I really this really helped me like formulate a good working relationship with emotions, because I was at the point where I decided I wanted to cut emotions out of my life. I thought, oh, these are just things that are like out of my control and they're not helping me. I can think straight without emotions. Very, very naive thought, but like that's where I was. But like ideally what you want is you don't want your emotions to ride you like you're the horse. You want to ride your emotions like you're the rider and it's the horse.
Right.
So you want to like harness that energy, that intensity. You want to experience it, but you want to be able to like steer it in the right direction.
Yeah.
When you're angry, you don't want to like take it out on your friend or something. Like you need to have that intellect involved to steer it correctly.
Yeah, and I think if you take that, I think that's a very wise way of living, because if you take that perspective on your emotions, like it becomes sort of like interesting how quickly you become able to sort of savor the negative experiences.
Yeah.
Because like living with emotions is part of what makes life so, meaningful. And like some of these very negative experiences are some of the most meaningful experiences in your life, but if you're the one riding it, you're the one that's like, okay, this is the time in my life that I get to experience this thing.
Yeah.
I will fully experience the emotion of it before it's over,
I remember like feeling heartbroken and just like, as painful as that is, you're like, God, but I feel alive right now. And like music never like cuts so deep, you're just like listening to the right song and you're like, whoa, this is intense. And it's so reflected in all of our culture. Like we don't watch any movies, or we don't even make really any movies that like are just a series of good things, happy things happening to people.
Right.
It's always challenge or horror or war. Like
struggle is part of the human like heroic story almost,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is, and this is just a side note, but for listeners that maybe the whole meditative way of seeing emotions doesn't make sense to them. Like, that's not how I experience emotions at all. Like, I just like feel angry and I gotta like punch a wall or like another way of thinking about it is like, if you think about your emotional experiences in retrospect, right? If you use the temporal dimension to think about it, and you think like, I had this emotion and I don't know where it came from. If you like reflect upon it after the fact, like a week or two later, and you think about it in the context of your experience, I feel like you also have that sort of thing where you can see it as a part of some other thing that were happening, where it's like, at the time you're like, well, I don't know why I was so sad.
But it's like revealed in hindsight.
Yeah, in hindsight, you can see like, oh, well, there was all this stuff that was happening in my life. And like, maybe there was a good reason for me to be sad, because once I take these things together and I can see what happened after I was sad, I can see that this was just a part of this larger thing,
And I think that's part of the purpose of emotions. Like, I don't think you get that perception, that insight without that emotion alerting to you. And a lot of times, like, the more intense emotions are built up that way because you've been ignoring something.
Right, yeah.
And that's why I think life has like all these built-in things. Like, you can ignore something as long as you want, but eventually it's going to hammer you and you're going to be forced to look at it.
Yeah, right, exactly. They almost have to come as a surprise a little bit sometimes because of that whole like ignorance part. It's like the experience of like ignorance and then revealing,
Yeah. So like the wise person eventually realizes that it makes sense to try to be aware of things and not ignore things.
Yeah.
And like just a little detour, like what Vipassana meditation specifically is, they kind of describe like these two wings of awareness and equanimity. So like the practice of meditation is just becoming aware of like every sensation on the body, every emotion. Like you're just paying attention to like you're fine tuning everything. So like that part of the practice is just like really like trying to feel everything that's there. And then equanimity is just like the non-judgment of those sensations. So like if you have an itch, you try not to scratch it, you try to just sit there with it.
But like the same thing where they're all sort of like equivalent in value, where like your nose itching is kind of the same weight as like remembering that it's your friend's birthday or something.
Right. It's kind of like the act of non-reaction to all of them, like kind of gives them the same weight.
Yeah.
And that by doing that, you develop this ability to like be more of that rider on the horse. And so like I had this experience after a 10-day silent retreat where like this dude like rear-ended me like in a very minor way.
Right.
And like I had this in this experience, but like many other lesser ones where like my immediate reaction was noticing that all of that pain and negativity wasn't there. And so therefore I'm getting giddy. I'm like laughing and kind of probably looking like a lunatic. But like I get out of my car and this guy's all stressed out and I go up to him and I slap him on the back. I'm like, look what you did, man. and then I just laugh and I told him I have a good day, and like that was that. I mean, it could have been a little more serious if it was more of a serious accident, but like
I wonder if it would have been, because you were almost surprised, it sounds like, by how little you were worried about it.
I still would have felt fine. I mean, I would have had the perspective, oh, like this happened and here we are. And
I love that way of describing it too, where you're just like, hey man, look what you did. Isn't life something?
Yeah. Yeah. Emotions are a trip, and I like kind of since coming out of that place in my life where I was trying to like cut them out completely, I've been on the path of trying to develop my EQ. So
yeah,
here we are talking about emotions. We kind of touched on this or last time, but Seth says he does have similar things to what we call emotions, right? Says we have strong emotional experience, far less limited, more expansive, much freer to feel experience. And then he goes on to say like kind of the main reasons is like our identities do not feel threatened, for example, by the strong emotions of another.
Yeah, I remember picking that up the last time too and thinking that was so interesting.
Yeah.
The way that our experience is sort of characterized is that there is this problem with like the level of consciousness that we're at, where we feel threatened by emotions. We feel threatened by our own emotions, and we feel threatened by the emotions of others. And how at this higher level, there's the idea of like embracing them and not being threatened by them, you know?
Yeah. I want to back up just a tiny bit. He gets into emotions after he's bringing up communication.
Sure. Yeah.
And he says we communicate telepathically, but then again, telepathy is the basis for your own languages, without which your symbolism would be meaningless.
I wondered a lot at that one.
Yeah, very provocative. I've thought about that one for years.
Yeah. Do you think it's true?
I kind of do. Like, I guess my ideas of, verbal language, like when you dig into it, it's just like, every word is dependent on other words for their meanings.
Yeah.
And none of them are grounded to anything unless we can say something like intuition or telepathy is grounding that to like our ideas of understanding and meaning.
Yeah. If I can sort of bring in a little bit of philosophy and stuff, like it really reminds me of like Wittgenstein, he's got this idea of like, he really like digs deep on like the concepts inherent in our language and how do we learn the concepts and how do we learn the language. And there's this sort of like interesting argument that, at the end of the day, we do just have to like call it just some form of like telepathic intuition or something.
Really? He gets there?
Like, I feel like he pretty much gets to that point. I don't know if you would call it telepathy, but it's like, there's this inbuilt ability for human beings to like talk about something and both know that the other one's mind is in the same place. And we have this like faith in it because like we are able to do it so well, but there's no real like logical justification for how we can do it.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if I could come up with a good example to just explain like how the argument is. But essentially it's like, yeah, if you like are trying to teach somebody any concept, like the classic pet example for a concept is like concept of a chair, right? It's like, you'd think a chair is a really easy concept to explain to somebody. It's just like a chair is a thing you sit in. And you're like, okay, so is a bike a chair because I sit on it? And it's like, well, not really because it's like moving. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess chairs can't move. So like, are wheelchairs chairs? It's like, well, maybe wheelchairs are chairs because they move, but they're also shit. It's like,
yeah.
Does a chair have to have 4 legs? Well, obviously not. You can have chairs that just have 1 leg, Or are they stools,
Right.
But it's like, we're still able to point at objects in the world and very easily be like, oh, can you get me a thing off the chair?
Somehow like very complicated verbal communication seems to work.
Yeah.
But when you try to like look at how the parts are actually functioning, it gets a little fuzzy. You look up a word in the dictionary to find out what it means, and there's like 17 words there.
Right.
And you like look up those 17 words. I mean, you quickly get the idea of where it's going, and that's what I mean by it's. We don't know that there's anything that conglomeration of words and meanings like refers to. It's just like this floating mass without.
And that's the problem with dictionaries too, is that dictionaries are all self-referential.
Yeah.
Like there's no entry point into a dictionary for a foreign language, right? Because you don't know any of the words. So it's like you can pick up a dictionary that's written in Russian, but you're not going to be able to read any of it if you can't read Cyrillic script.
Yeah. So yeah, that particular comment has always like struck me that way. But then he goes on to say, like, because this is leading into emotions, and then he's talking about the way he communicates. We communicate instead through what I can only call thermal and electromagnetic images that are capable of supporting much more meaning in one sequence. The intensity of the communication is dependent upon the emotional intensity behind it. So, and then he goes right into the emotions. So like, we had that little discussion about emotions, but like, he's saying that that's a basic part of communication.
Yeah.
And, we just got done like exploring this idea that what our emotions are just like this bleed through of these larger psychological events. So just trying to understand what emotions are and their function. We talked about like just gaining all this hindsight wisdom from these emotions. So like, I'm just like laying all this out there to try to like connect it. Cause I feel like understanding emotions is still something of a challenge to me.
I mean, it's a worthwhile challenge, right?
Yeah.
I feel like we're all there.
Yeah.
for this one, the thermal and electromagnetic images that are the emotional intensity, like it changes with that. It just makes me think, like I kept imagining like like 90s special effects, like very like low quality, like CGI, like how would you like show this, if you're doing a movie based on Seth, like somebody beaming these like radio waves or like thermal images into your brain.
It's like the David Lynch version of Dune. It's just like that's so easy.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You've got all these like weird, like color blended, like, sceneries and things. Yeah.
That's our show, but fear not, the never-ending conversation continues next week. If you're enjoying the show, please be so kind as to subscribe, like, rate, and review, and if you're feeling frisky, tell a friend. Contact us at implicatingthereal@gmail.com. You can support the show at patreon.com/implicatingthereal. We are doing our best, but whatever support you can lend helps us appreciably. We are not affiliated with the publishers or proprietors, but we encourage you to get the books. You can follow along as we endeavor to dive deep into the Sethian worldview, and there's really nothing like cultivating your own relationship with the material. Until next week, we wish you a fun good evening.